Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've got a really interesting set of insights to dig into today, all about the future of Europe and how things might shake out if we see a second Trump administration.
It's fascinating stuff. The source material kind of paints this picture of like a potential turning point in global politics.
Starting point.
Yeah, a paradigm shift,
Yeah.
especially for how Europe interacts with the US and China.
Okay, paradigm shift. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, we're talking like the fall of the Berlin Wall kind of big.
It could be that significant, yeah. The source argues that a Trump return could signal, well, the end of America as we've known it in terms of global leadership. Less multilateralism, more America first.
So a move away from those big international agreements and organizations, huh?
Exactly. And more focus on those one-on-one deals, kind of like a more transactional approach to foreign policy.
Interesting. So how would that impact Europe specifically?
Well, the source suggests we could see a widening gap between the US and Europe on some pretty big issues. Think trade, defense, even the war in Ukraine. Wow. Okay.
Like, imagine if the U.S. just decides to strike a deal with Russia to end the war, but the terms are terrible for Europe.
That would put them in a tough spot.
Right. Or what if the U.S. slaps tariffs on European goods to protect American industries?
Yeah, that'd be rough. You mentioned China earlier. Where do they fit into all of this?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. The source basically argues that Europe might end up needing China more than ever before.
Needing them, really?
Yeah, both economically and, when it comes to tech.
Hmm. That's a pretty big shift, isn't it? I mean, for decades, the US and Europe have been super tight.
Absolutely. But the source points to a few things that are driving this potential shift towards China. One is Europe's economic situation. It's been kind of sluggish compared to the U.S., so China starts to look like a more attractive partner.
Makes sense. And the other thing driving this is
Technology.
Mm.
The source says that Europe just doesn't have those big tech giants that the U.S. has, like Google or Apple.
So they're falling behind in that global tech race. That's the idea. And the source also highlights, the rise of political divisions within Europe itself.
Like what?
Well, think about the far-right parties that are becoming more popular in some countries. They're often skeptical of both the U.S. and China.
Right. So that makes it harder for Europe to present a united front on the world stage.
Exactly. And that could push them toward those more independent partnerships we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so Europe's got some serious challenges ahead. Is there, one specific thing that really highlights these vulnerabilities?
The source actually uses the electric vehicle crisis as, a powerful symbol.
EVs.
Yep. While China's been surging ahead with EV technology, batteries, all that green tech, Europe's manufacturers are having a tough time keeping up.
That's a great point. Everyone's talking about EVs, and it feels like China's already winning that race.
For sure. And the source suggests it's partly because Europe hasn't been as focused on the long game, investing and planning strategically. China's been pouring resources into EVs and building the infrastructure for years.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of those massive solar farms and wind turbine installations they've got going on. It's pretty mind-blowing.
Right. And it's not just about building the tech itself. It's about making it all work together.
So having a plan and actually sticking to it, it seems like China's got that figured out while Europe's playing catch-up.
Exactly. And this difference in approach, it shows up in other areas too, like manufacturing, supply chains, even how they see EVs fitting into the whole tech ecosystem. The source says that Europe could really learn from China's more, holistic approach to innovation.
Wow. That's a pretty big statement.
Yeah.
For years, we've heard about China learning from the West. Now we're saying maybe it's the other way around.
It is a pretty interesting thought, isn't it? So we're talking about this idea of Europe actually, learning from China, even in areas where traditionally it's been the other way around.
All right. It's kind of a humbling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
Admitting that there are things they could learn from a country that's been, playing catch up for so long.
Exactly. This source dives into some concrete examples too, like renewable energy, for example. Europe was an early leader in solar and wind power, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But now China's the one dominating global production and installation of all that stuff. Solar panels, wind turbines, batteries for EVs.
It's crazy how quickly they've ramped up those industries. Those pictures you see of their solar farms. Massive.
Totally. And the source is saying that this is where Europe could really take a page from China's playbook. It's not just about, coming up with the tech. It's about putting it all together into a system that actually works.
Right. Thinking about the whole picture, not just the individual parts.
Exactly. And China's been really good at building those complete supply chains, too, from
Mhm.
raw materials all the way to the finished product.
Something that Europe maybe hasn't been as successful at.
The source seems to think so. They
Yeah.
use the EV industry as an example again. European car makers have definitely made progress on EVs,
Yeah.
but they just haven't been able to match the speed and scale of some of these Chinese companies.
Like BYD, right? I've been reading about them. They're really shaking things up.
They are. They've got the tech, the manufacturing, the distribution networks. They're heading all the right notes.
So it's about more than just designing a cool electric car. You got to be able to build it efficiently, get it to market fast, and make it affordable.
That's the key. And the source argues that China's been so successful because they're willing to think long term. Invest heavily in strategic industries, even if it means sacrificing some profits in the short term.
Interesting. Because that's something we don't always see in Western economies, right? It's often more about those quarterly earnings reports and keeping shareholders happy.
That's the stereotype, yeah. And the source is suggesting that this short-term thinking could be holding Europe back, especially in industries like renewable energy, EVs, even AI, things that require, sustained investment and a vision for the future.
So is the source saying that Europe needs to basically rethink its whole economic model?
It's not explicitly stated, but it's definitely implied. And this ties into another big takeaway: the need for a more holistic approach to innovation. The source argues that China's been really good at creating these interconnected ecosystems that support innovation across different sectors.
Okay, I'm not quite picturing that. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's stick with EVs for a minute.
Hmm.
China hasn't just focused on the cars themselves, right? They've also gone all in on battery tech, charging infrastructure, even smart grids to handle the extra electricity demand. It's like creating a whole system where all the pieces work together.
So it's about more than just individual technologies. It's about seeing how everything fits together, the bigger picture.
Exactly. And the source thinks Europe could learn from that, especially when it comes to renewable energy and green technology. A more integrated strategy could really help them hit those ambitious climate goals they've set.
That's a pretty big shift in thinking, though, right? Is Europe really ready for that?
That's the million-dollar question. The source acknowledges that it would mean overcoming some pretty deeply ingrained assumptions, maybe even challenging some powerful interests.
Right.
But they also say that, the alternative could be even worse, like sticking with those old models and hoping for the best. That could lead to even further decline.
So it's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
In a way, yeah. And this is where things get really interesting because the source doesn't offer any easy answers. They're basically saying that Europe has to make some tough choices.
Cling to the old ways or try something radically new.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive: the potential risks and rewards of this whole paradigm shift.
So we've been talking about this idea of Europe, actually learning from China, even in areas where they've been the leader historically. It's definitely a different way of looking at things.
It is. And the source gets into some really specific takeaways for Europe. One that jumps out is this idea of what they call strategic patience.
Strategic patience. Okay, what's that all about?
Well, it's this idea that China's really good at playing the long game, right? They're willing to invest in research and development and build infrastructure even when the payoff isn't immediate.
So resisting that urge to chase quick profits and focusing on building something sustainable.
Exactly. And the source argues that this kind of short-term thinking has hurt Europe, especially in industries that require a long-term vision. Renewables, EVs, even AI.
Right. It makes you think maybe Europe needs to rethink some things about their economic model to really stay competitive.
Yeah, that's a big question the source raises. And it's connected to another key takeaway, which is this idea of a more holistic approach to innovation.
Holistic architect.
The source argues that China's been successful because they create these interconnected ecosystems, right, where innovation's happening across a bunch of different sectors, all supporting each other.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Let's go back to EVs. China's not just focused on building the cars, right? They've invested heavily in the batteries, the charging infrastructure, even smart grid tech to manage that increased demand for electricity.
So they're thinking about the whole system, not just the individual pieces.
Exactly. And the source thinks Europe could really benefit from this kind of approach, especially when it comes to renewable energy, and hitting their climate goals.
It's a big ask, though, asking Europe to make such a fundamental shift in their thinking.
It is, and the source acknowledges that. They say it would mean, overcoming some deeply ingrained assumptions, maybe even challenging some pretty powerful interests.
Yeah, there'd definitely be pushback.
For sure, but they also make the point that the alternative might be even worse, clinging to the old ways and hoping for the best.
Right. It's like they're at a real crossroads. Do they stick with what they know or take a chance on something new?
That's the dilemma. And the source doesn't offer any easy answers. They just lay out the choices and the potential consequences.
It's a powerful message for sure. And I think it applies not just to Europe, but to all of us, right? We're all facing these big questions about how to navigate this rapidly changing world.
Absolutely. What lessons can we learn from Europe's experience? What choices do we need to make in our own countries and communities? These are things we all need to be thinking about.
For sure. This deep dive has given us a lot to chew on, and hopefully it sparked some interesting conversations for our listeners as well. If you enjoyed this exploration of Europe's potential future, be sure to like and subscribe to the deep dive for more thought-provoking discussions on the biggest issues facing our world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.